All right. Hello, everyone. I'd like to get started. So on behalf of Saltise and Dawson College, I would like to welcome you, to those of you here in the room and to those of you watching the live stream. I'd like to welcome you to the second keynote event for the 2022 Saltise Conference. My name's Chris Whitaker. I teach physics here at Dawson. I'm on the executive of Saltise and have been involved with Saltise for a long time with Liz. It's my pleasure to introduce the guest speaker. Unfortunately, the original guest speaker, Dr. Kimberly Gomez, had a family emergency and isn't able to be here today. We thank her for collaborating with us, and we thank her in particular for sending us or suggesting to us a speaker who was able to make it up today. So as a close collaborator of Dr. Gomez, we're happy that Unsang Li was able to say yes and come up on short notice. He's going to talk about work that they've done together and work that he's continuing to do. And it's particularly relevant and important to the kind of work that we are interested in as a community. I should note that Dr. Li has a very busy schedule, so he flies out tomorrow. He's back in California tomorrow. He's in Las Vegas on Sunday, and he's in Korea next week or the week after. So we kind of got him at the right time. So thank you for putting us into the beginning of your schedule. I sort of wonder if it had been towards the end of that schedule, if he had been as willing to make all the travel after that. So I'm glad you've come at the beginning of your travels for this summer. Just a quick question about how we're going to proceed. So there will be time for questions at the end. There'll be time for questions from the audience in the room and from those of you listening to the live stream. What'll happen after the keynote is done is we'll have two people come up on stage to monitor the chat and feed us questions from the Grenadine line. So if you're online and listening, please put your questions into the Q&A module on Grenadine. We'll get to those after the keynote. We're going to keep the questions to the end after the keynote, but we should have a good 15 minutes for questions. Our guest speaker is Dr. Unsang Li. He started his professional career as an elementary school teacher in Detroit. Was a little unhappy with some of the structural challenges that he faced sort of improving pedagogy in the classroom, particularly around issues of equity and justice and inclusion. And so he turned to a career of crime, a career of research. So he transitioned to educational research and did his PhD at the UCLA Graduate School of Education in Informational Studies, where among other things, he helped to launch the UC Digital Cultures Lab, an entity focused on public scholarship at the intersection of digital technologies and social movements. And for the past year, he's been a postdoctoral fellow at both UC San Diego and UC Irvine. And this summer, he starts a position as assistant professor at the University of Nevada at Las Vegas. Dr. Li's work is focused on design-based research, researcher-practitioner partnerships, and the notion of co-design, particularly in the area of helping schools advance racial justice and around issues of equity in schools, including the use of technologies and equity. And he's therefore, I think, perfectly suited to this conference today. Touches on a lot of the things that we as researchers and practitioners are interested in knowing more about. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Dr. Unsang Li as our keynote speaker for today, and save your questions to the end. We'll have a chance to get to them. So, Dr. Li.
All right, hi everyone. Chris, thank you so much for the amazing introduction. And Liz and Mike for stewarding this amazing community that I've had the privilege of joining this week. You know, I didn't know much about it, but by the evidence so far, I just really appreciate the sort of commitment to educators and students to sort of identities that are still really, core to my being, right? So any communities that are, really pushing the agenda forward for educators and students is one that, I'm just feel so privileged to be part of. And I'm sure, everybody here feels exactly the same way. So thanks so much. And also, I would always take an opportunity to, find people who will take me in if something happens down south of the border. And if I have to make a run for it, please let me know if I could stay at your place. Yeah. And also I want to thank Dr. Gomez, who couldn't be here today, but she's been my mentor and just everything that has sort of everything that's formed the basis of my intellectual development and development as a researcher. So it's really unfortunate that she can't be here today, but I'm going to do my best to sort of carry that spirit forward and I make it sound like something terrible happened, but it really she's fine and she sends her regards. But I really feel privileged to represent her here as well. So today I'm going to sort of share a couple of lines of work that both Dr. Gomez and I have pursued together, really thinking about once again, and I think this is why I'm so, once again, privileged to be here, focusing on student learning and educator learning in the context of participatory design, sort of folks coming together and doing the social work of designing for justice and equity in schools. So I want to, oh, sorry. We have a little signal. So I think there are a few sort of folks that I think this presentation will be really sort of will connect to. One is sort of those who are really thinking deeply about how do we organize learning for social change, right? Not just content area learning, but really connecting that content area learning to broader sort of social goals that we all hold. The second is really thinking about how do we make learning, designs for learning, responsive to local context, assets, and needs. And then finally, thinking about how do we reposition students, and when I say students here, learners, right, more broadly, as active knowledge producers and social designers. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to start with a quick sort of introduction. I think Chris kind of, did a really brief sort of introduction to sort of what brought me to participatory design, but I want to revisit that really quickly. And then I'm going to talk just really briefly about why I think, right, or why we think participatory design offers us really sort of productive processes to engage in sort of justice-focused, equity-focused social change. And then I'm going to go through a couple of examples, one really focused on K-12 students as sort of the core drivers of social change making, and then the second piece being teachers as that sort of driving force. And then finally, I want to make sense of all this together, sort of share some concluding thoughts about sort of our takeaways from these two studies, as well as engage in a little Q&A. My path to participatory design as sort of a research method and also pedagogy, right, really stemmed from my own experiences as a teacher. If you look at a picture here, it's a group of fifth grade students who have sort of conceptualized what their curriculum should look like and centered it around sort of a core question of, what do they want the future of education in their community to look like? And by sort of engaging in sort of the content area learning, right, whether that's English language arts or math, science, they sort of conceptualized a project to really represent their sort of collective learning in the form of an art piece. And this was sort of a huge leap for me as an educator, and it happened because I was lucky enough to be connected to sort of a group of teacher organizers that were really already sort of engaging in this participatory critical pedagogy, and they brought me in to their community, right? And it was a community of teachers as well as digital media artists who worked together to design sort of what curriculum could look like in the city of Detroit, and then created structures to bring students into that conversation to really sort of reimagine what elementary school education could look like, right? And so we had this sort of teacher and artist learning community that then expanded that learning into it sort of extended that sort of space for the students. So this is sort of a huge turning point for me, and I knew that the folks who are running this program were really inspired by participatory design as sort of an organizing framework. And so, and what actually ended up happening was, through this sort of transformation of pedagogy, I met a lot of sort of resistance, right, in the sort of traditional learning systems. And so I kind of went to grad school out of anger more than anything, right, which is not the most productive way to go to grad school, but that's sort of where I was. And to go back to Dr. Kim Gomez, she was my advisor, and I told her, hey, like, if we're not doing work with students, and if we're not sort of doing this reimagining work with students and educators, that I didn't see sort of higher education and research as a place for me. And sure enough, she was already engaging in this work of research practice partnerships and participatory design and co-design. And so it really became sort of a perfect fit. And that's where I was able to sort of launch, right, the sort of the couple of projects that I'll be sharing about today, actually. So I just want to start by going over, I want to go over really quickly, sort of the conceptual basis of what participatory design and why, right? And I spoke earlier about, I think the thing that really makes participatory design unique in relation to maybe other forms of design, and even those that involve multiple stakeholders, is that it's really focused on the social change-making aspect, right? It is a move towards imagining and actually designing for a just and equitable future. And there's a few sort of assumptions about social transformation that actually inform or really well aligned with the processes that are sort of typical in participatory design. So first of all, from a sort of social transformation perspective, it occurs in sort of complex macro to micro systems, right? That these ideas about equity and justice, they're huge macro level problems, but they're embedded in sort of organizational structures. They're embedded in interactions, interpersonal interactions, and they're embedded in sort of the identity development of individuals. The second piece is that there needs to be a space for what we call counter narratives and community assets in this change-making work. If we engage in this social transformation without the sort of alternative counter narratives that are often hidden from the current ways in which educational practices are developed, then we conjecture that sort of we're going to end up with the same sort of outcomes, essentially. And then finally, and this comes from sort of the critical tradition, right, that theory and action need to be sort of integrated, and we really need to make sure that the two are informing each other. And what we know about learning, and therefore, the kind of learning theory that informs participatory design also kind of aligns with some of these assumptions. We know that learning is a political process and a sociocultural process, so it interacts with the macro level politics, the micro level politics, as well as local contexts in which that learning takes place. The second is that we know that community drives learning, both in terms of the internal sort of interpersonal communities that we work with, such as you all, right, Saltise as a community, for example, as well as the broader sort of macro level communities and cultures that we're embedded in. And then finally, once again, in terms of the learning process, that there's so much learning and expansive ways of thinking that happen when we put our action and reflection on that action in relation to developing theory or existing theory. So that's where sort of participatory design, I think, brings a lot of value into sort of integrating those assumptions, right? Just a quick overview of what we mean when we say participatory design. First, we really care about building community, and not just any community, but the kind of community that really privileges the voices of those who are often sort of marginalized from design conversations, right, in education. And we identify sort of shared goals together, and identify problems and then share goals together, right? We design, refine, and implement interventions rooted in sort of the collective theory that we're developing, and then we study those designs in practice, right? We implement those practices and see, what we see in the context, and it's and then we do it all over again. We might realize that, hey, we didn't invite all the important people in the table. We might realize that, hey, we missed something in our initial sort of theory development that we should have really thought a little bit more deeply about, and then we redesign, re-implement, and kind of go through that process again. But to be a little bit more specific, and the sort of the question that I want to grapple with today is, a little bit more, a deeper dive into what does transformation through participatory design look like, and what actually facilitates that in terms of the role of the educator or researcher, the processes that we put in place, and then what kind of transformation does that lead to, right? So I want to focus on three sort of outcomes. First of all, what kind of learning infrastructures and communities are developed as a result of participatory design? What kind of domain practices, let's say science education or any domain, right? What kind of knowledge can be constructed around those domains through community? And then finally, oh, shoot, sorry. One more. Oh man, I had all that missing this entire time? Okay, well, I think we're okay. This is the important one, so thank you. Let's see, where were we? Okay, and the identity, right? Like what kind of personal transformation happens as a result of participation in these structures. I want to focus in terms of sort of processes, how we build community across boundaries, how we make visible and center sort of these invisibilized community assets, goals, and needs in typical sort of educational design. And then I want to pay attention to, think about, as a process, how do we pay attention to politics, power, and ideology in these co-design processes? And obviously, all these we view as having sort of unique affordances, right? And then, I'm going to make some comments about sort of the role of the instructor or researcher as archivists, as translators, and facilitators. And that's for all the educators here, right? So the first example, I'm gonna sort of share these thoughts through two examples. One is a work that was based off my dissertation, which sort of sought to design school technology practices with students from minoritized communities in Los Angeles, right? So this just as a kind of quick overview, this is a 4-year partnership with students from immigrant backgrounds in Los Angeles. And the aim was to kind of create a space for students to reverse sort of exclusionary practices and bring students into key areas of school learning and design, right? To give a little more context, sorry, I keep forgetting this. Thank you so much, Chris. So to give a little more context, this is a time when the district actually invested, I think, something like I'm going to say it's either $3 million or $30 million. That's a huge difference, but it's one or the other, into iPads, right? And actually what had happened was the media was actually sort of characterizing students as sort of malicious hackers, right? When students actually hacked into these iPads to access like learning videos on YouTube, right? The mainstream narrative was, hey, these students are not following the protocol. And actually, so what happened? It actually led to the firing of the superintendent at the time because there's so much politics involved. There's much more to it, but the key problem that sort of we were trying to address is, hey, it's really clear that students are really grappling with what they know already and the goals that they hold around education with these newly introduced tools, but why aren't they a part of the official sort of sense making around these tools, right? So we sort of formed a collaborative effort with a group of students who had sort of complete decision-making authority over, the design work that we were pursuing, what kinds of tools that they wanted to bring into the process, and what sort of what they were trying to accomplish, right? And this is where sort of the context is really important. And once again, I go back to this idea of community, right? There already was the students actually already had an existing community that really supported their participation in this work. The school was a school-university partnership school that already had sort of, at least for the teachers, ways of engaging in sort of these design processes that really were rooted in the local context. And a sort of rich historical, cultural sort of community that surrounded that school, right? It also had really sort of strong guiding principles for organizational learning as well as pedagogy at the school. But like I said, there are some gaps in terms of this idea that, hey, we're really technology rich, but integration poor. We don't have a clear vision or practices around what we're going to do with all these tools that we're sort of left with, right? So that was sort of a big issue. But the point I'm trying to make is that there are already sort of rich community and organizational assets in the space. So the initial sort of stage of this work was to really identify sort of design frameworks with the students, right? Oh, yes. Man, I'm so bad at this. Oh, man. Okay. Well, this is the school. So, for example, we would engage with students in debates about, hey, what is the purpose of K-12 education, right? And we would, as researchers, we would really summarize sort of these conversations that students are having and help them build sort of design frameworks that help them sort of conceptualize certain practices in the school. So those things included things like, hey, we really care about balancing the social skills and the academics. We want to make sure that our learning outside of the school is made visible inside of the school. College access was still a huge concern for the students, right? And that they wanted to sort of create ongoing structures to amplify their voice beyond their own time in this structure. But it wasn't just the design frameworks that we defined together, it was also the sort of participatory structures, right? How do students engage in this work? So we asked them, we probed, where do you guys want to be in 1 year from now through this experience, right? And they said, hey, it's really important that we have opportunities to practice critical skills that are going to carry us beyond our time in this partnership. That it's important to us that we make, in this structure, diverse students' perspectives visible. And that, it's really important that we don't keep this work in this group, but that it's actually implemented in the school setting, right? So what that meant was that we created this sort of participatory design structure that was interest-driven, and students were, oh, sorry, thank you. Oh, no, go back one. Yeah, that students would design sort of technology practices that were really rooted in their own interests and their own practices outside of the school, that they were going to bridge multiple stakeholders. So the next step was to really talk to teachers about their designs and actually support them in implementation, right? And then once again, really thinking about deeply about how do we continue to use these designs to strengthen student voice. And so what that meant was that students, for example, created a sort of a more permanent student-led participatory design space within the school as an after-school program. They sort of brought their designs to teachers and helped them implement some of their designs in the school context, which I'll share a little bit more about in a second. And yeah, sort of continue to sort of refine sort of the designs by inviting a larger stakeholder group, right? In this case, teachers, primarily teachers and also some of their parents. And one sort of design that I want to focus on is this e-portfolio that one student group built, right? So this is sort of an example of a student-designed e-portfolio system that they eventually implemented school-wide, right? So you can see sort of the connections to the design frameworks that students articulated, right? This student, his name is Ray, her e-portfolio really focuses on her identity as a writer, right? She really saw herself as a writer and wanted a tool that would bridge that identity that she's developed actually outside of school into her college-going process, into the in-school learning that's happening. So she wanted to make this identity visible to everybody around her in school. And she sort of justified her rationale for this work was that, hey, we have different identities, but through these portfolios, they can get a glimpse into who you are, right? One of the things that this school implements is that we're a community, that we grow together, but we don't have the tools to actually do that, right? So what she ended up, oh, sorry. And sort of her work around this really came from her, like I said, her identity as a writer. So, and not only her identity as a writer in school, but something that she had developed through her sort of story as an immigrant, right? Story as a member of a writing community that led to sort of these aspirations as a writer down the line. So, eventually she designed this e-portfolio, worked with teachers to implement it as school-wide. And you begin to see sort of how through her participation in participatory design, her identity is beginning to expand, right? So she said, at first I felt like a guinea pig, and you would ask us what is working, what isn't, and I would go like, well, let me tell you what's not working, right? I usually don't talk to authority figures in schools and wait for them to talk to me. So I felt really honored to be part of something big in our school. Now I see us as mentors, right? I don't see us as guinea pigs anymore. Even when we went to help the ninth graders, the teacher would ask us how to do this. But to have teacher talk to me for help, it was like, whoa, I'm actually helping these kids. So it's a way to say I'm eligible and I'm qualified. So this is actually the students who designed the e-portfolio right after, and the teachers in the middle, and we were presented at an undergraduate course at UCLA that's geared towards preparing teachers, right? So not only is this idea sort of percolating in the school context, but now she's taking on the role of being sort of a knowledge creator at the broader higher education context. The second example I want to talk about is an effort that we engaged in to design an elementary school computer science curriculum with a group of teachers. And I want to leave as much time as possible for questions, so I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. But the partnership here was to basically engage teachers, principals, researchers, and sort of traditional sort of curriculum developers, right, around computer science to engage in co-design of computer science pedagogy, right, and curriculum. And really the problem space was that, hey, it was originally the curriculum designers that came to us and said, hey, we're having real problem with take-up with teachers. And their narrative was sort of a deficit-views one, right, for teachers. They say, hey, teachers really don't know anything about computer science and they're really scared of it. How can we get them to use our, curriculum a little bit more? We think we have a really good idea, but we're just not sure what's going on, so to speak, right? And the goal was to really push a tool, a curriculum that's available to students who are teaching sort of public schools, right, where they're mostly serving students from, minoritized backgrounds. So the original curriculum that the curriculum designers developed was really focused on sort of individual problem completion and algorithmic problem solving. Oh, sorry. Oh yeah, we're good. And you can kind of see an example of this, right? So, there's this really sort of predetermined sort of painting that the student is supposed to sort of code to paint just kind of a general picture, right? And the sort of learning model was to sort of for the teacher to lecture a particular computer science concept, for the teacher to model it, and then the students to sort of practice that on their own, right, as an individual. So it's something you see, in a lot of learning spaces. But the problem was somewhat abstract, right? Over here, you see the student being asked to sort of basically code basically like a loop type thing. And so the sort of underlying ideology or assumption about computer science was that, computer science as sort of this technical work that is about, learning to code, essentially. Now, I know this is, next one. This is kind of an overwhelming graph, but I don't want you to pay so much attention to actually what's in the boxes, but more that we actually mapped out sort of the ideological landscape of the designers that we brought to the table. So on the left side in yellow are the ones that the computer science curriculum designers and sort of their assumptions about computer science that they brought to the design table, right? On the right-hand side is when we interviewed the teachers about, hey, what do you see as the goal of computer science education, right? How does that relate to sort of your broader equity goals? These are the kind of ideas that they brought. And then we identified sort of ideological ideas or sort of assumptions about computer science that they both shared, which is really around using computer science as sort of a social change-making tool, as well as a sort of space to develop more general problem-solving skills. So when we realized that there's so much diversity in the way that the participants were thinking about co-design, thinking about the design of the computer science curriculum, we actually reconfigured the partnership process. And you see here, on the left is something that the curriculum designer came to us and sort of shared with us, right? So on the left-hand side, you'll kind of see how we present it to the teachers, how we sort of reimagine the design process. One from the coding, the curriculum designers sort of telling the designers, right, the teachers, sort of what kind of design frameworks to operate under, to actually the teacher designers framing that sort of design process, right? And sort of the boundaries of the design being sort of a little bit more, I guess, malleable, right? So I think what the Citrus Coding, which is the curriculum designer that we partnered with, one of their designers told us, I think is illustrative of this. So she said, hey, first we were like, let's all work towards problem completion, right? Their traditional sort of learning model. We know we should teach kids how to code in order to solve these challenges that we define. We're realizing that there is so much more around equity goals that you as teachers have for the bigger picture of computer science education for kids. And that's what sort of informed this reconfiguration of co-design process. So basically what we landed on was for each teacher to actually co-design a computer science curriculum based off their own assumptions of equity, and bring those designs to the broader collective to really think about what kind of options are available, right? What kind of diversity around equity and computer science might exist in practice settings. So to focus on one teacher, Jill, she really wanted to focus on computer science as a tool to build sort of learning practices that could transfer to other content areas and other domains. So she saw sort of a connection between the kinds of learning that happens in computer science into the science, into English language arts, and she wanted to make sure that those connections were a lot more concrete. But she also saw sort of computer science education as situated in broader social context. She said that, hey, I know that this is a sort of emerging field that folks are using to engage in all kinds of sort of social change making, right? I want students to see some of those applications of computer science in the curriculum. So we engaged in this sort of design together, but she sort of really drove from multiple sort of areas of knowledge that she brought to the table, right? Those included pedagogical knowledge that she already had. For example, in the math context, she focused on pedagogy that really focused on making student thinking visible. Design knowledge, she had already had a lot of experience designing her own curriculum, not just by herself, but in teams, whether that's in a department or in her school, right? And then finally, she had this reflective orientation to say, hey, I already engaged in this process of, always examining what my students are doing and bringing that back to the way that I rethink about curriculum, right? So then when you put those together, new sort of design configuration, as well as these assets that she brought to the table, she sort of completely reconceptualized what a sort of typical unit or a lesson in this work could look like. So these are a few slides from sort of the lesson that she developed. She first contextualized the students' learning in this, in sort of an example of a couple of computer scientists who had developed this robot that, and I think this is in Canada actually, at UBC, that where a couple of students designed this robot, right, and programmed this robot to basically plant sort of tree saplings in areas that require sort of reforestation, right? So this is how she introduced the unit to the students. And then she challenged the students to do the same, essentially, right, and think about, hey, you and your classmates are being asked to reforest a particular section in California, and you're going to program a robot on this programming site to really think about how are you going to do this, right, and make justifications for it. So basically what you're seeing is students, first of all, planning based off of their knowledge of science, where they what might be an ecologically reasonable place to plant these saplings, right? And then using their computer science knowledge to actually code for a sort of representation of a robot to plant these saplings, right? Using sort of coding concepts. And then finally, writing out a justification for their designs, right? So you see sort of the ways in which the design frameworks and the design goals of the teacher really sort of got represented and sort of changed the sort of domain practice of computer science through this participatory design process. So I want to kind of wrap up sort of what the takeaway from these two, projects are. First of all, for instructors and researchers, right? That I think there's a responsibility to take on sort of a different role, almost a different job description for educators and researchers, essentially. One is to be sort of take on a more facilitator role, right? Really thinking about how do you organize design activities? How do you frame the collaboration that is happening in the space? And how do you broker not just knowledge, but also people, right? How do you bring different communities together so that the people participating in this work can actually find the spaces that really expand and sort of make their work impactful, right? The second is to be sort of an archivist. I know this doesn't sound exciting, but there's a big sort of role to be played in making sure that the appropriate data is being collected and represented in ways that are accessible to the co-designers. And that you're taking this historical view, right? That this knowledge creation doesn't just happen. It's not isolated in a particular moment in time. That there's a historical sort of timeline to the way these designs develop and these communities develop. And then finally, to be a translator, right? How do you translate between theory and practice? How do you translate across stakeholders? And how do you translate across disciplines? And I think these are really sort of interesting roles that researchers and educators can sort of take on. And so finally, I just kind of want to revisit sort of, the ideas that I wanted to deal with today, right? How does participatory design, what ways of facilitating participatory design lead to what kind of social change making, right? I talked about the role of individual instructors and researchers and what role they might be able to play. I talked about sort of how these participatory structures and processes could be organized, right? By building community across boundaries, by making visible sort of knowledge and assets and goals that are typically sort of hidden under the rug a lot of times. And then what happens when we pay attention to ideology, power, politics, right, in that process. And I hope we were able to sort of give you a glimpse into the kind of community building, infrastructure building that could happen through that process, the domain practices that get developed through these processes, and then finally, the personal transformation that happens when one engages in these kinds of participatory design processes. So I'll end it there in terms of my sort of sharing about our work, and I want to open it up to actually before. I'll end it there. I do want to open up enough space for questions, so I'll stop there. Thank you so much for being an amazing audience, and I'm excited to hear some questions.
Oh, there we go. All right, so just as a reminder of the process going forward now, we've got some folks that will be looking at the online chats on Grenadine and the questions there. And we'll go sort of from in the room to online as much as we can. And Sophie, if you can come up and be our runner. There you go. So Sophie will come around and give you the mic if you have a question. Any questions in the audience, please put up your hands. Awesome. Yeah, run, Sophie, run. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you. Thank you for a great talk. When you mentioned how the students were given latitude to create or design their own education, what parameters, if any, were set for them? Was it a matter of complete carte blanche, or at the other end, was it like, here is the goals, but you decide how to get there, or like, how broad were their freedoms in choosing those things?
I don't know this still. Oh yeah, the only parameters that we set was essentially saying that, hey, we have this problem with technology in schools. Researchers and educators have no idea what they're doing. We need your perspective on this, right? And figure out, so the problem and the fact that we wanted to actually engage in change making, right? That, we wanted their expertise as a way to actually change the practices in the school. So those are the only two parameters. The rest, we put the faith in students that they would engage in work that, that they had sort of an eye towards the community, right? Eye towards sort of like an egalitarian eye almost, that they would have everybody's best interest in mind, and also that they would speak best for their peer, themselves and their peers, which was important to us. So it was really broad.
Great, thanks. So we're going to go to an online question, but in the meantime, for those of you in the room, if you want to ask a question, please put up your hand so Sophie can get to you now. But let's go to an online question. Miriam?
Yes, or if you're especially shy, you want to ask your question on the platform online, it's anonymous if you prefer. So the online question is, it's clear you are talking about shifting the role of students in your design projects. Would you describe your project as student-centered learning, or do your design projects see limitations or even risks of emphasizing a student-centered approach?
Do I see my work as student-centered learning? I would say, so to answer the first question, I think there's a danger. So, while the design parameters are really wide and sort of flexible, I also think, I was having this conversation with Chris yesterday, actually, there's sort of a role that, instructors or researchers play, right? We're not saying we don't have expertise, right? We actually have a lot of expertise around, sort of engaging in systematic inquiry. We have a lot of expertise in being really good listeners, at the best of it, right? Some of us are really bad at it, but I think most of the time, as researchers and educators, we're pretty good at that, right? We're also really good at sort of organizing ideas, and sort of reflecting them back to people. These kinds of skills that we develop as educators, right, and researchers. So I think rooting sort of our role and really sort of being clear about the assets that we bring too, right, as educators, and sticking to those assets, I think is a really important part. So it's not just sort of a free-for-all, do what you want type of thing, right? The second question is, what are the risks, or are there risks? Is that right?
Do your design projects see limitations or risks of emphasizing student-centered approach?
Risks. I want to say, I feel like maybe a risk is a kind of dangerous way to frame it. I would almost say that there are problematic opportunities, maybe, right? So what opportunities are afforded when, let's say, I don't know, just to talk about a really visceral example, let's say a student takes a very anti-vaxxer stance or something, right? Or maybe students might bring maybe racially problematic views to the table, right? Those are challenges, right? But I think there are also opportunities for learning, and I think at the best of it, once again, I was talking to Chris about this yesterday, but what is a student or a participant in participatory design actually telling us when they share these problematic views, right? Is the surface level thing the most important thing, or are they trying to tell us something about their needs or some of their trauma or experiences, right? And I think it's really important to kind of not just see it as risk or a problem, but really think about it as an opportunity to sort of dig deeper into sort of the conceptual landscape in the work. So that takes skill for sure, and practice. And so I think, yeah, the more, I think that's also where some of these, once again, tools of the researcher actually become really useful around sort of archiving or translating or, right, sort of reflecting back, right? I think that's where sort of, I don't know, the sort of sharp edges get blunted a little bit, maybe, of these views. But I don't have like a sure answer to that, I guess, because there's so much complexity that goes into it.
Great, thanks. Next question from inside the theater.
Thank you for those great examples. And I think one of the interesting things to me about that was that they were both very clearly authentic problems. And one of the things that comes from that is they're multidisciplinary. And at the K to 7, K to 8 level, that can be much easier to facilitate that multidisciplinary type of solution. And I'm wondering if you've thought about or tried any projects at the high school level where topics tend to be more siloed, and so it's more difficult to work across these multidisciplinary areas. I'm a CS teacher, so that CS example brings in environmental studies, it brings in geography, and so that would be very difficult to do at the high school level. I'm wondering if you've thought about that or tried any projects in that area.
Yeah, actually, so that particular school that this work happened in, the student design work, they actually had created a really strong kind of multidisciplinary curriculum for elementary students in that same school, right? And actually, when I was working there, they were in the process of actually grappling with, hey, how do we actually implement this in the high school level, right? Or sort of secondary school level. And it was really, really challenging. And in some ways, actually, for the teachers, they actually had an interest in building this e-portfolio program too, because they also wanted to see learning that happened across sort of these disciplinary settings, right? So the idea actually didn't I didn't get into it, but the idea didn't only come from the students. The idea also, or some element of that design framework came from the teachers too, right? And I say that to say that I think the most important aspect of that is that, or maybe the challenge is, how do we build infrastructures, right, at the organizational level or institutional level to actually, it may be a question of multidisciplinary sort of learning. It might be an entirely different question, right? But what are the kinds of infrastructures that we can put in place in educational settings so that stakeholders can actually sort of engage in this problem solving and learning and learn from other knowledgeable experts, learn from students, so on and so forth, right? And once again, there's no silver bullet, but in the school that I'm talking about, for example, they did have these infrastructures to bring in other researchers who do have some knowledge in specific sort of content domains, or they did have experts that were particularly good at facilitating sort of co-design efforts, and they were really actively sort of building the infrastructure for design, so that they can actually sort of engage in these kind of complex problems, right? That go beyond sort of the content domains, for lack of a better word. So it's really looking at the school as sort of a complex organism, right, an ecology, and thinking about then what are the bridges and the buildings and the roads that we have to build so that those pieces of the ecology are really connected, right, and that we can drive between those sort of ecologies as easily as possible. And it's still going to be a challenge, but at least the bridges are there, or at least we can start sort of traveling, right?
Great, thank you for that. We have, I'm going to try and wrap things up in the next 5 minutes. We've got until 2 o'clock. But one more online question. Miriam.
So following the description of the design projects, may we classify it within the action-oriented approach that gives the main priority to learners' motivation and engagement?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes.
Please?
Following the description of the design projects, may we classify it within the action-oriented approach that gives the main priority to learners' motivation and engagement?
That sounds like, is that a question? Sorry.
There's a clarification that just came in. Mm-hmm. Based on the design project's description, may we consider them as part of the action-oriented approach?
Mm-hmm.
So, perhaps it wasn't posed clearly enough. We'll ask the other question. In looking at your model, how do you suggest we start to build community around the boundaries if not all stakeholders are willing?
I mean, in some ways, I think that's the work that I see my work kind of, that's one of the goals that I have, right? I think there are multiple entry points to kind of pushing this work forward. But obviously, we all need to sort of, there's sort of I think there's sort of a political aspect to this work, right? Like in changing the landscape of education. So I see myself not just as a researcher, but as a sort of a policy advocate, right? Even me standing here is sort of a, it comes from a desire to actually sort of urge people to build the kind of infrastructures that sort of bridge these stakeholders. And part of that obviously is kind of showing the proof of concept, so to speak. But so I think we all need, and I think my push for all educators and all researchers is to have like a political agenda, right? Without that, I think we're not going to sort of see the future of education that we want to see. But at the local level, I think at the local level, I think it's really, this kind of goes back to the earlier point about, I think a lot of times people don't want to engage in this work because they don't see, they don't believe that their voices are going to be heard, right? And so sort of people kind of revert to sort of, kind of, getting shelled up and stuff like that. So I think it really is about, once again, and I think we need to build sort of competencies and skills around this, but, how do we make sure that voices are really represented and make sure that they're feeling heard, right? Just to be a little more concrete, for example, we're engaging in a partnership with a teachers union, right? And we have representatives from a union really thinking about, what can the union do to advance racial justice together as a key player in this work. And, there are teachers that are really, they all have a similar goal, which is to broadly advance racial justice in schools together. But folks have different angles to it, right? So, for example, in the work, there was this sort of tension point, right, where the question was, in this racial justice, the partnership is about racial justice, but there's one teacher or a couple teachers in particular that really kind of came back to this idea of sexual harassment in school settings and the danger that they experience every day as a majority woman workforce that they experience on a day-to-day basis, right? And so sort of participants in this are going back and forth about, well, is this about gender? Is this about race? What are we trying to do, right? But really, what the teacher was really saying was that, hey, these problems are sort of intersectional, and that the work of doing racial justice is really tied up with the way that we experience this profession as women, right? And that we really need to actually pay attention to the risk that women are going to be putting themselves under if we are trying to push this racial justice agenda forward. So, that's how we kind of, and recognizing that actually kind of reoriented us to then say, okay, then what are the things that, what are the sort of safety measures that need to be put in place and that actually need to be practiced so that we could do this racial justice work, right? So I think, that's one example of it, and obviously people have different sort of points of entry for that resistance, but I think it's really about, developing processes and systems to make sure that not only, it's not just, oh, I hear you, but I hear you, and so we're gonna do this, right? I think that's a really important aspect of it.
Thank you, Dr. Li. I think that's all the time that we have.
Actually, I've been given permission to go one more question. Okay. So if there is a question in the audience, awesome. We'll make this the last question. The next set of sessions start at 2:15, so we have a little bit of time. Go ahead.
Yes, a huge fan of your work. Just have a...
Sorry, I think mic is off.
Hello? Yeah. So first of all, it's an amazing work that you do. So I have two simple questions. So the first one is, if the participatory design, right? So does that require students to have to do some sort of collaborative effort, like group work, or it can be, individual work? So that's a question one. Question two is, what's the major differentiation point from participatory design to, let's see, service-based learning, and or let's say critical making? Yes.
So the first question was, sorry, can you go back to the first question again, please? It was, oh, does it have to be collaborative? Okay. Yeah. Does it have to be collaborative?
So, have you thought about the shared identity, shared like beliefs? Yeah.
So I guess I think one thing is that variation is actually really important, right? Like, I think the question is really more, and I think some of our examples kind of got to this, but the question is more, how do we bring these varied, anything from something big like an ideological stance to maybe even just kind of like disciplinary knowledge or whatever have you, right? Just how do we build, once again, I keep going back to this idea of infrastructures, and I think infrastructures could exist at the sort of like institutional organizational level, but I also think infrastructures could exist in sort of the interpersonal level, right? Like, what are the routines and processes that we conceptualize together to ultimately actually kind of build the collective knowledge, right? So it is about social change making. So ultimately we need people to come into this work. But how we get there, I think we need to sort of strategize based off of what's going on at the local context, right? So for the teachers who engaged in the computer science design, for example, we weren't quite there in terms of identifying a clear framework for design, right? And so we created these sort of lines for teachers to sort of develop their own designs, and then to bring those designs together and think about, okay, then what can I see in that other person's design that I can use for my own, right? What can I learn from that person's way of thinking about equity that I can learn from, right? And so I don't think the goal is necessarily to come to sort of like a singularity, so to speak. I think the goal is to actually make those differences visible and continue to sort of expand sort of the possibilities of what sort of this social change could look like ultimately. I think the second question was, how's it different from service learning? I don't know to precisely, but I think if I were to guess, I think service learning, I think the power dynamics in service learning, it typically tends to be sort of like the object of learning is pretty set by, I think, sort of authority figures in the learning space, right? So at the I guess participatory design probably asks sort of at the service of what a little bit more than maybe like traditional service learning sort of processes. And then critical making, I think there's a lot of overlap. So I wouldn't be able to discuss sort of like really concrete differences other than maybe that, no, I think in the sense that they're both engaged in sort of this design process to engage in social change making, I think is the same. Maybe it's that sort of participatory design really thinks about sort of these democratic structures a little bit more in the design process, right? So I think technically you can do critical making on your own, right? Whereas I don't think you can really do that in participatory design, maybe. But I'm kind of speaking out of ignorance a little bit, so I'm open to other perspectives.
All right, maybe last word to Jim Slota, and then we'll wrap things up.
Okay, just on the kind of critical making front, the first example you showed, to me, seemed distinct from the other example. Like, participatory design's been around for a long time, and I mean, multiple disciplines, right? Architecture, public health. I think the first one you showed was really youth participatory design. And I would encourage you to kind of keep that as distinct from the second example you showed, which was participatory design with teachers, and that's something that we do. I've done that a lot. And I always find that when I do that, I end up with something like the robot forest planting thing that none of your students would really care that much about. Versus if the students had to plan and design. So I really think you kind of have a cascade of design stakeholders. And the first one you have that brings out the actual youth identity, like critical making would, is really distinct. And I think you should not, I don't know if you need to or want to like look at all of this as participatory design. I think youth participatory design would be a distinct thing and for a distinct purpose. And the broader umbrella of participatory design could hold that, but I really resonated with the first one as being so powerful at getting that youth voice out and connecting and giving that permission and that authority to the kids. And the second one just seemed like good old participatory design to me. Not a question.
Yeah.
Just a comment. Well, although you might have something to say about that because you put them together for a reason. So.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think the core thing that I think they do share, right, is that I think ultimately, especially in the American context, it's like educators have kind of been positioned as almost like second-class citizens in a sense, right? And their expertise and like intellectual prowess is often sort of unrecognized and marginalized. So maybe the thing that they do share is that, and obviously, when you dig deeper, I mean, the racial landscape, the powered landscape, all these things are very distinct, right, between teachers and sort of students in public schools. But maybe what they do share is that sort of in a macro sort of setting, they really they represent certain voices in education that really aren't sort of brought into the sort of constructive space, so to speak. So that's kind of the connection that I see between the two. But yes, I mean, definitely. I mean, even in industrial settings, that's a particular kind of participatory design. Teachers, that's a particular, and I mean, personally, the sort of space that I want to move to is actually sort of more community-based approaches, right? So it didn't, the work that we reported on didn't involve parent voices, for example, or not much of it at the very least. And there's still questions about, okay, then when we bring a real sort of authority figure, so to speak, right, into the conversation, then what happens, and how do we actually sort of deal with that tension, right? So, yeah, I think there's still a lot of space that we need to explore and build knowledge around to really ask these questions that ultimately speak to like the sustainability of this work and the impact of this work at the macro level. So that's something that I really feel strongly about, is how do we actually inform policy and inform regional structures and even the role of universities, right, and how the university sees itself around in the long term. So that's kind of where I want to take my work, at least, moving forward.
Great. So thank you to everyone here in the room. Thank you to everybody watching online. And a particular thank you to Dr. Li for making the journey all the way here on short notice, giving an amazing talk, a lot to digest. And it's a perfect, it goes perfectly with what Saltise is all about. Your talk touched on a lot of really great points. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Li.